So welcome everybody. I have to tell you, um, things are getting more intense, and I am feeling a little wonky. Um, there, there's, I don't know if you feel it. I mean, I'm assuming that most of you are paying attention to news, not only of what's going on in Israel, which is starting to get a little scarier because now it's starting. There was an incident not far from where we live. The people that were injured were security officers from Israel, and they did neutralize the terrorists, but it was pretty close to home. But more than that, so I have a child, my youngest daughter, who lives in the Boston area, and she's married to an Israeli, and she's paying very close attention, obviously, to what's going on. And the things that she sends me about what's going on social media, what's going on in America, are really kind of mind blowing. And I I feel like the this is not what I wanted to talk to you tonight about. I just need to just share because um, I'm very aware that we are going through something. We collectively, globally, are going through something that Israel and the Jewish people are kind of at the forefront of, but it's impacting everybody. And we've spoken about this before, about this concept of good versus evil and the world splitting into two camps. And I know and I trust that all of you are in the camp with Israel, in the camp with the Jewish people, but it is escalating. And so that's very much on my mind. So I just want to say that to just um, to, to dedicate the Torah learning that we do together tonight to the protection of the Jewish people in Israel and all around the
Mm,
world, to the freeing of the hostages, whichever among them are still alive, to the the refuah shlema, the complete healing of those who are injured, and um, to the I don't know another way to say it, to the revelation of Mashiach and the next stage of this, because it is um, I feel like the noose is tightening, and the only way, yes, I feel the escalation, and I don't know if you guys feel it also where you
yeah.
are, but um, it's very, very strong right now. Somebody said that they can't hear. The rest of you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Um, okay, so Andrea, I don't know if it's your internet connection, um, but I am going to go on um, and share my screen, and let's start with okay, let's start with today's letter, um, as we always do. Okay, today's letter is the letter Yud, which is this little tiny letter in three different fonts. It is a very, very, very common letter used in the Hebrew alphabet, and its numerical value is 10. So you might have noticed that starting with Aleph, that was 1. So that we've been doing this for 10 weeks. Next week, the numerical value of the letter will not be 11, but it will be 20. And so after Yud, we're going to increase by tens. And the way that we would say 11 is to combine the letter Yud and the letter Aleph, because Aleph is 1, Yud is 10. So now we have to do a little bit of math, and that's how we get to 11. So that's how the system works. So we'll talk about that more next week. So this is the Yud, like this or like this or like this, depending on the font. And this is what my children grew up calling little baby Yud. Um, okay, so let's just share a couple of words. the Hebrew word that is Yud Daled. Now, you know both of those two letters. Yud Daled means hand. Okay. The plural of hand is Yadayim. And if you know any Hebrew at all, you know that the ending im often refers to a plural word. So this here is the word Yadayim, which means hands, right? More than one. And you see that it actually has three yuds. I just found that interesting. The word Yehudi, which means Jew, begins with a yud. And also the way that in Hebrew we spell Hashem's name starts with a yud. So it's a yud and a hey and a vav and another hey. This is the name of Hashem that we do not pronounce. When a Jew wants to say this, they will either say Hashem or they will say Yud K Vav K. Now you know that this letter that repeats itself is a hey, not a K, but we're trying to be as far away as we can from coming close to saying Hashem's name. So even we don't spell it exactly accurately. It's like trying to protect that which is holy as much as possible. And here's just a little teaching that the yud kind of looks like a flame, and it represents the soul's desire to connect with and to unite with Hashem. Okay, so that's the letter yud. When you go to look at your Hebrew text and you're looking for yuds, yudayim, I guess I'm not even sure what they're called. Yudim, I don't know what the plural of yuds is. Let's just say when you're looking for the letter yud, you will find it very, very often. So it'll be very easy for you to recognize. Okay. And so the topic that any questions about the alphabet, the letter yud, anything so far? Any comments? Okay. So the topic that I prepared today is Lashon Hara. And I think a number of you have heard of this, and we want to go like a little bit more deeply. For those of you that have not heard of this concept, it's two Hebrew words. That is the... Okay, somebody's not muted, and let me see. Can I mute her? Can I do that? Yeah. Okay. Okay. If you have something to say, I'm always happy to hear it. I just don't want to hear background noise. Okay. So in very simple terms, Lashon Hara is a prohibition that comes from the Torah of speaking gossip. Literally, it means the evil tongue. Lashon is the Hebrew word for tongue, and it's also the Hebrew word for language. And Ra is evil, as opposed to Tov, which was a word we learned last year, which means good. Ra means evil, and the prefix of Hey or Ha always means the. So literally, Lashon Hara is tongue the evil. Okay, but we don't, obviously, when we're translating into English, we make it make sense in English. So it is Lashon Hara, the evil tongue. The prohibition against Lashon Hara is an important part of the universal wisdom of Torah. It's life advice that applies to anyone. So many, many years ago, I had a non-observant friend who said that it was learning about the laws of Lashon Hara that convinced her that the Torah was truth, and that following a Torah lifestyle was clearly a godly way to live. And so we're going to get into it so that you can see how deep it goes. Now, Jews have many, many very specific laws about Lashon Hara, which I'm not going to go over tonight, okay? Because the general principles apply to everyone. But I will tell you that, all right, so I just pulled off my shelf. I will send these to you. 1, 2, 3, 4 books about this topic that are meant to guide Jews in how we use the power of speech. Okay, but for our purposes, I want you to understand the general structure and what the spiritual significance is of this prohibition. Okay, so let me just give you a little excuse me, a little bit of background. There's 3 primary categories of problematic speech according to the Torah. And the names of these are not important. I just want you to understand the larger concept. So the most general is called in Hebrew richilut, which means gossip. Richilut isn't necessarily negative. It is going around telling people what other people have said or what other people have done. Okay, sort of the conventional understanding of what gossip is. Negative speech that's false, that is meant to slander or defame somebody, in Hebrew is called motzi shem ra. Literally, it means to give a bad name. Okay, and it's when a person lies in order to make somebody else look bad. Okay. And then there's the category of actual Lashon Hara, which technically refers to speech that causes harm, like saying somebody is a bad driver, somebody broke the law. The statement might be true. In fact, technically, to be Lashon Hara in that third category, it has to be true. If it's not true, it falls into one of the other categories. Okay. But the idea, the pivotal idea, is that it would come to hurt the person about whom these words were spoken. Okay, so it's any statement that, if spread from one person to another, would damage somebody, either physically put them in danger, harm their property, annoy them, frighten them, harm their reputation, any kind of speech that would cause hurt to another person. Okay. So as I said, Lashon Hara technically refers only to something that's true, that's harmful if other people find out about it, and not malicious lies, because malicious lies fall in another category, or harmless gossip. But I don't know how much gossip is harmless, but in practice, Lashon Hara colloquially, the way we speak about it is, it encompasses all three. So it's anything that one would say about another person that could cause them harm. Okay. Now let's go and look at the biblical source for this. A biblical source for this, and this is the one I want to focus on, you'll find in the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 16. I'll just read it to you in English. You shall not go around as a gossip monger amidst your people. You shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood. I am the Lord. So there's three parts of this verse. You shall not go around as a gossip monger among your people. That's one. Number two, you shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood, and I am the Lord. Okay, we're going to concentrate today on the first part of this verse, but I just want to take a moment to understand the other part. So part two, you shall not stand by the shedding of your fellow's blood. According to Rashi, the premier foremost biblical commentator, it means watching your another person die when you have the ability to save them, like if they're drowning in a river, or if there's a wild beast or robbers that come upon him. We're not going to focus on that part of it, because it isn't at play for many of us for most of our lives. But part three, I want you to pay attention to. So God in this verse is telling us two things we shouldn't do. Okay, we shouldn't speak Lashon Hara, and we shouldn't stand idly by if somebody is dying and we could do something to prevent it. But the third part, I am the Lord, implies I am the Lord who is faithful to pay a reward to those who heed the other two warnings, and also faithful to exact punishment upon those who transgress them. Okay, you with me? So this tells us that Hashem is going to reward people who avoid speaking Lashon Hara, and also punish those who transgress this prohibition. So it's a pretty big deal, because God has been very, very specific that this is a matter that he pays very close attention to. As I said, the specific laws of Lashon Hara are many, detailed, and Jews often have questions about whether, under what circumstances, certain things may be said. So I'll tell you a story. I don't know if I ever told you this story, but in this context, I'll say it. There was once a time where there was a young man that we knew personally, who we heard that he was engaged, and he had cheated a friend of ours out of a significant amount of money. Okay, so we knew all the players, and we did not know the fiance. And we wanted to know, are we allowed to alert the fiance that this man has this history before they get married? Because obviously this seems to fall into the laws of Lashon Hara, right? However, because because God knows his creatures and he knows who he created, he knows that there are times when it is not only permissible, but it is actually required to speak up in order to prevent another person from being harmed. So it's very important that you understand, because sometimes Lashon Hara is used as a weapon to silence people in times, in occasions where they really do need to speak up. Okay. So while we are trying to facilitate harmonious relationships among people across the board, we are not trying to let liars and cheaters um, get away with murder because nobody wants to talk about or what they're doing, or people who are committing acts of abuse or all that stuff. That's why we have these very specific laws. Most of the time in normal situations, we do not speak about other people. We attempt to not speak about other people in a negative way, but sometimes it is not only permissible but required. And in fact, we consulted with a rabbi who was an expert in these laws. We were given permission, and we were able to contact the family of this fiance. We told her what we knew, and that marriage should not go forward. And I feel like we did that in the, it's a weird way of saying it, like in the holiest way that we could, being very, very conscious of these laws and trying to protect this young woman who had no idea that she was about to marry someone who was a little shady. Okay. It is quite impossible, I think, to appreciate the worldview of Judaism without having some familiarity with this concept of Lashon Hara. So it is, if you've heard about it, and I'm assuming that many of you have, just because many of you have been around for quite a while, you may have heard it just translated as gossip, but that kind of misses the bigger picture, because although gossiping is not a good habit, it's not necessarily evil. But according to Torah law, when you say something derogatory about a person, whether that derogatory information is true or is not, is forbidden, except under these very exceptional circumstances. So Jewish thought considers this very common practice as one of the greatest moral evils. It's a very unusual, let me say it again. Jewish thought regards this common social practice as one of the greatest moral evils. We are not talking about something very unusual that only a small percentage of people do. We are talking about something that happens constantly. If a person is not aware of it and they're just a normal person living a normal life, chances are they are indulging in this kind of forbidden speech on a kind of regular basis. In Judaism, the sin of speaking Lashon Hara is regarded as the equal to the sins of idolatry, forbidden sexual acts, and murder combined. Those three sins, idolatry, forbidden sexual acts, and murder, are the three sins that, according to Judaism, you must give up your life rather than to transgress. So there is a number of things you probably are aware that in a Torah way of thinking, we can transgress a number of things in order to preserve life. So, for example, if it is necessary to break Shabbat because somebody is, God forbid, having a heart attack, let's say, there's no question that you break Shabbat. You make the call, you get in the car, you do whatever you have to do to save a life. Okay. But in this case, this trumps the three sins for which you are not permitted to transgress. So the classic example of this in Judaism is if somebody puts a gun in your hand and says, kill this third party or I will kill you, you are required to give up your life. Now, I don't want to dwell on this. I'm just saying that in Jewish tradition, the sin of Lashon Hara was responsible for the destruction of the Second Temple. It's a sin that God refuses to overlook, and it brings retribution on the person who speaks Lashon Hara, both in this world and in the next world. So you're getting the idea that is very serious stuff. So now I want to talk about why Why is this so serious? So let's look at a verse in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 6, that refers to when God formed man out of the dust from the earth, and he blew into his nostrils the soul of life, and man became a living being. Okay, that's Bereshit, Genesis chapter 2, verse 6. There's a translator of the Torah named Onkelos, who was a convert, by the way, who translated the Torah from Hebrew into Aramaic, and he translates what is here in this verse as a living being as speaking. So his version of the, and man became a speaking being. God's breath in man, the source of the divine life force in a human being, is manifest in us as the power of speech. The ability we have to express our innermost thoughts and to communicate them to other people is what connects us to the divine, because God created a lot of things, a lot of living things. And those are all wonderful things. But the solitary exception of human beings is that everything that God created is mute. Only humans are able to comprehend and verbalize the idea that our very existence is an expression of God and his gift to us. So we are literally, we human beings who have the power of speech, we are literally the only things that God created with this power. Only we can give voice to the testimony that the entire universe was created for. Our power of speech is our reason for being. So King Solomon expressed this thought in a more dramatic way in the book of Mishlei, in the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 21. Death and life are in the hands of the tongue, and whoever loves either will eat of its fruit. Okay, so what does that mean? Here's a story. I'm going to read you a story. There's a king in well, I'll sort of read it, tell it to you. There's a king in Persia. By the way, this is not necessarily a true story. It's a midrash. It's a parable to make the point. What does it mean that life and death are connected to our ability to speak? So the king of Persia takes ill, and his doctors tell him that in order to recover, he needs to drink the milk of a lioness. So someone volunteers to bring the kid fresh lion's milk, which you can imagine is not so easy to acquire. And he asked, in order to help him, he asked for 10 goats. So they give him 10 goats, and he travels to where the lions are. And on the first day, when he's like the lioness that he wants to get milk from is looking at him and he's looking at her, he throws a goat to her, but he's still far away. The next day he comes a little closer, and by the 10th day, he's been giving her a goat a day. By the 10th day, he's won her trust, and he manages to milk this lioness and brings this full jug of lion's milk to this Persian king. Okay, on his way back, he has this vision, and the parts of his body are arguing. So the legs say, none of the other limbs can compare to us. If we would not have transported the body, it would have been impossible to obtain this milk. And the hands argue that if they hadn't performed the various acts necessary, it would have been impossible to obtain the milk. And the heart says, if it hadn't, or the brain, whatever, if it hadn't come up with the idea of the goats and gradually earning the trust of the lioness, it would have been impossible to obtain the milk. And the tongue argued that if it had not spoken up, the whole project would have been dead in the water. So everybody, all the different parts of the body are turn on the tongue and say, how do you even make that claim? You're in a dark place hidden away. You can't do anything. You can't think of anything. And the tongue says to them, however you understand this, you're going to see that this very day you will all agree that I am your master. Okay, so the man is all this is playing out in his mind. He goes to the king and he says with this jug of milk, and he says to the king, your majesty, here is the bitch's milk. And the king is enraged by this coarse speech, and he demands that this guy who just brought him the cure of this lioness milk should be hung. And on the way to the execution, all of the limbs are kind of hysterical at what has happened. And the tongue says to them, didn't I tell you that you're all helpless? if I save you, will you acknowledge that I am the superior one? And they all agree. And so the man asks the executioner to let him speak with the king just one last time. And he is granted that request. And he tells the king to try the milk because it's going to cure him. And anyway, many people refer to a lioness, or I guess other female animals, as bitch. And the king tries the milk and he's cured and the man is spared. And the Midrash explains that death and life, this is an example of how death and life are in the hands of the tongue. Okay. So the legs have their part, the hands have their part, the brain has its part, or the heart has its part, but it's the tongue and the choice of words that save the man's life. Okay. So it's emphasizing a concept that we often overlook, that the impact of events in our lives are not measured by the events themselves, but the impact is a function of the way that they are perceived and communicated. So this rule applies to the universe as a whole, just as much as it does to things that take place within it. It's kind of that speech and the ability to speak about something is what gives the world its form. It gives the world its people its understanding. Let's go on and you'll see what I mean. The world that God created is not clear cut. It does not speak for itself. And that's why you can see that certain people can look at the same situation, and the situation that we're in right now is a great example of that. People look at the same situation and they derive very different conclusions because the world, the way God created it at this stage of history, is subject to interpretation. That everything that happens in the world can be interpreted in more than one way. So until words are put to it, no one knows how to size up the significance of anything. So I'm sure you've had a situation where something's happened and you're not sure what to think about it. Is this a good thing? Is it not a good thing? Is this the right choice? Is this not the right choice? It takes the ability to think and speak about a situation to give it its identity, if this makes any sense. Okay. So here, take for example, imagine there's this man who he didn't have much starting out. He came from a poor family and he worked his way up and he becomes like the pinnacle of success. So someone can put him down and say that he comes from a low class family. That would be like a way of insulting him. But someone else can see the exact same situation and relate to it with admiration and say, look at what he managed to accomplish, even without without money to get him started, without strong family support, without an education, whatever he was lacking. So the same situation can be understood in both ways. Let's say another example. Let's say that there's a woman who dominates an important meeting and she manages to prevail, whatever her position is, over strong opposition. So some people are going to see that as she's rude and overbearing, and everybody just decided to let her have her way because they couldn't deal with her anymore. And others will say with admiration, she knows how to stand up for her principles. She fought hard to defend her beliefs. So events and actions provide a backdrop against which the tongue, or our ability to speak, is where it expresses itself. So for example, there are people who work as publicists. Sometimes we call them spin doctors today. They are people who can take a situation and spin it the best possible way using the power of speech. So it's really impossible to exaggerate the significance of this. And I'll give you an example that relates to Purim, which is coming up. So Thursday is the fast of Esther. And then in the part of Israel where we live, Purim is Saturday night and Sunday. Okay, so here's a story about the bad guy in the Purim story and how he uses the power of speech. So a certain rabbi said no one could speak Lashon Hara like Haman. He said to Achashverosh, I don't know what you call him, Ahasuerus or something like that. Let's destroy them, meaning the Jews. And the king said, this is from the Talmud and not from the Megillah, not from the book of Esther itself, that the king answers, I'm afraid of their God because he might do to me what he did to earlier kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Sancherib, who were all destroyed for their mistreatment of the Jewish people. So this is the conversation between them. So Haman says, "Oh, they are not keeping mitzvahs anymore, and so they're weak, and we can overcome them." And the king says, "Well, what about their rabbis?" And Haman says, "The the rabbis are just like the rest of them. They're all scattered. They're all separated. They've kind of lost their inner cohesion." And so the Midrash is revealing the enormous implications of this conversation between these two men. So Haman is clearly speaking gossip, clearly speaking Lashon Hara against the Jews in the empire of Achashverosh, and it reverberates throughout the universe. Okay. And so here we'll get a little bit more spiritual. There is a concept in Judaism of a heavenly court that decides up there what happens down here. And our words down here impact what a heavenly court decides. So Haman's words were so powerful that they were responsible for the edict of destruction, for the to be issued against the Jewish people. That came from heaven, and was actualized in earth. Now, Haman could have looked at the same phenomenon. Okay, let's say it was true that the Jews in the empire of Ahasuerus, who were 70 years before had been pulled out of the land of Israel. Let's say that they were not keeping mitzvahs so well. Okay, they had a low level of observance. They somebody who was looking at them might see the same thing, but interpret it as they are discouraged, they are depressed, rather than they have become disconnected from God. Now, why would excuse me, why would the Jews of that time have become discouraged? Excuse me. According to everyone's calculations, it was supposed to be 70 years of this Babylonian exile, and it should have been over already by this time. And the Jews should have been allowed to return to Israel, but that didn't seem to be happening. So, out of a sense that perhaps God has abandoned them in Bavel and Babylon, their connection to mitzvot, their connection to God, was in fact weakened. But Haman chose to interpret that lack of mitzvah observance not due to mere discouragement, but it's a manifestation of a total loss of direction and a complete abandonment of faith. So, in other words, he's saying to Achashverosh that this is a perfect time to get them because they are not doing what God wants them to do, and therefore they are weak and we can prevail. And the heavenly court was forced to accept this interpretation as legitimate because, in fact, the Jews were not as careful with their mitzvah observance as they had been in the past. So a negative interpretation that fits the facts on the ground, spiritually, you can't just ignore it, because there, in the heavenly court, there's an attribute of justice and an attribute of chesed, of kindness, or of judging more favorably. So there's sort of, if you can imagine, these two like attorneys that are arguing what's going to be the fate of something that's happening down on earth. And the attribute of justice wants strict justice, and the attribute of chesed wants basically people to cut that God should cut them some slack. Okay. But in fact, in this case, the attribute of justice prevailed, and the edict of destruction was issued. And it could only be overturned when the Jews refuted Haman's interpretation of the facts. How do they do that? Through teshuvah, through repentance, through getting close to God. Okay, so this is an example using the Purim story, but this is an example of the dynamic of why Lashon Hara, why when we interpret things in a negative way and speak negatively about other people, why it has such profound ramifications and why it's such a huge sin. Okay, so again, this enormous power that our speech has is not only limited to the negative repercussions in this world, but also the impact that it has in heaven, because we are like the spokespeople of the universe, because we're the only ones that have the power of speech. We're the only creature that God selected to teach us to give us an ability to communicate. We are the beings who were appointed to interpret creation and communicate its meaning. So our definitions superimpose themselves on reality. Excuse me, give me a second. I told you that the word Lashon in Hebrew means tongue. It is it's also a word that refers to the bar that balances on the top. You think of an old-fashioned scale, right, with like two things here and a bar on top. The part of the mechanism that tilts the scale is also called a lashon. It is the tongue that weighs all of humanity's ambiguous actions and tips the balance either in the direction of innocence or guilt. So the scales of justice are like under the direction of under the jurisdiction of the tongue. So under normal circumstances, the heavenly court is always inclined to be lenient and patient. If there are two possible motivations and actions, it will always adopt the more favorable view. And God is not in a hurry. He's always willing to give the benefit of the doubt. But if down here on earth, we interpret the actions of other people in an unfavorable light, then the heavenly court is bound by that. It accepts the unfavorable interpretation and proceeds accordingly. So so here's, I hope this is being clear. Something happens in this world, okay? A certain action, a certain interaction, and so forth. It is up to the way that we interpret it with our speech that leads to a decision in the heavenly court, a decision of whether it's going to be judged harshly or judged compassionately. Okay. It is evil speech that leads to judgment, not the evil action itself. This is part of the reason why Judaism considers Lashon Hara such a terrible sin, because we are influencing the spiritual outcome of a situation. Okay. And that's why we take it so very seriously. Okay. The tongue is also measuring a balance between physicality and spirituality. So we are all combinations of physical and spiritual. We have bodies and we have souls. And in bodies, we inhabit in this world a world of limitation. This world is finite, and we compete with each other for a limited supply, what we perceive as a limited supply of goods and honors and blessings and so forth. So you may know the expression a zero-sum game. If the other person wins, if they get the job, if they get the leadership role, if they get the money, if they get the admiration of others, if they win the prize, whatever, then by definition, I lose, because there's only, in the physical world, there's only a finite quantity of whatever. So theoretically, whatever someone in our life has could be understood to be something that I could have had, or I could still have. In this sort of situation, the natural human tendency is to tend to put other people down, because everybody's feeling competitive. And you may not recognize, you have to think about this a little bit about your own life. You may not recognize that it is competition with other people that makes people speak this way in the first place. Okay. Because if I bring somebody down, that makes me closer to getting whatever the prize is. Okay. If you live in a finite world with finite rewards, then that type of worldview, which is a physical, grounded, non-spiritual worldview, leads directly to evil speech. And I don't have to, I'm reading. Do you know the name Mitch Albom? He's a novelist, and his books all have Jewish theme. Well, maybe they don't, but he wrote, the first book he wrote that became like a blockbuster was called Tuesdays with Morrie. It was a very, very famous book. Anyway, he just released a book called The Little Liar, and it's about the Holocaust. And it takes place in Greece, in the Jewish community in Salonika in Greece. That's not the point, but the point is that when I'm reading, it's a novel, but I'm reading about the behavior of the Nazis and the way that the way that they perceived things, there was no place for Jews to remain in the world because it took away from what the Germans wanted for themselves. Okay, so that it's a very big example. In a much smaller example, um, we have situations in our lives, in our communities, in our families where we feel compelled to speak negatively about somebody else because they have or they are on track to get something that we want for ourselves. Okay, so um, that's the physical. If you are 100% like a physical person, I know you're not because you're here studying, learning Torah with me, but that's how it appears in the physical world. But we also have souls, and souls are limitless. Every one of us was sent into this world to accomplish something unique, and we were given the means and the personality and the circumstances to do it. Our bodies are the suits that we wear to be able to function in the physical world. So, in a spiritual perspective, in reality, none of us are in competition with one another. It's impossible for anybody to get a hold of anything that was decreed by God for someone else. So, there's nothing to be gained if someone else fails. See how this works? If if you think that there's only, let's say there's $100 on the table, okay, and you think that one thinks that if they speak Lashon Hara, somebody's having a lot of trouble connecting and reconnecting, but anyway, if they speak Lashon Hara about somebody else, they're closer to getting that $100. That's a physical, this world kind of way of thinking. There's only one $100 bill and they want it and they're going to do whatever they need to do to get it. In the spiritual way of thinking, if that $100 is intended for you by God, it's going to come to you. You don't have to speak evil about other people. You don't have to lie. You don't have to cheat. You don't have to do anything. And if it doesn't come to you, it wasn't meant for you. Now, I'm speaking here about money, but this could be about anything. It's a mindset that, so we have a tradition that on Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of each new Hebrew year, that God declares how much money. I know this applies to Jews. I'm sorry, I don't know how it applies to non-Jews, but God declares how much money every Jewish person is going to get that year. And if you when we are in our like physical world mindset, we think, well, if I'm going to make X amount working 40 hours a week, then if I work 60 hours a week, I'll make, X plus 50%. But it doesn't actually work that way because God runs the world and he decides what your number is. And you might bring in 50% more, but God will take that right out of your pocket because he'll make your car engine blow up, or he'll make you have to replace your roof, or you'll have God forbid, you'll have medical expenses that were unexpected that will come up, whatever. So that at the end of the year, your balance sheet is whatever it was. So on the one hand, we are required to put in normal human effort to get the things that are like that are designated for us, but not superhuman effort because God runs the world. Okay. So if you have this concept that we're not in competition with each other, it's impossible to get something that was decreed by God for something else, and it's also impossible for you not to get what is coming to you, then there's nothing to be gained by speaking Lashon Hara, by causing somebody else to look bad or to hurt their reputation or to lie about something that they did. Okay, so just to extend this a little further, a person should see that their part of their mission is to help anyone that they possibly can be successful at whatever they're here to do. There's nothing to be gained by bringing anyone down, so there's no incentive for evil speech. The amount of Lashon Hara that a person speaks is kind of a yardstick that can be used to see how much does a person see themselves and other people as primarily spiritual, and how much do they see themselves and the world and other people as primarily physical. Is this making sense? Do you see where what I'm trying to build? So a spiritual level, a person's spiritual level is not just measured by theology. because you can walk around, you can walk around with a lot of Bible verses in your head or a lot of theological beliefs and so forth, and still feel about yourself that you're living in a physical world where there's competition for resources and you have to do whatever you can to assure that you get the resources that you get. Okay. So, Lashon Hara is a behavior that makes sense if a person thinks that they are primarily a body. And that's what it means that the tongue is an accurate measuring stick of a person's true spiritual level beyond whatever theology, whatever Bible, whatever prayer. That's all. It's an important part of things, but it's not the only thing. Now, let me tell you, I just want to take a break here for a minute from my notes and say this, even though I understand what I've just shared with you, and I believe it's so helpful as a framework for understanding why God takes Lashon Hara so seriously, it's an enormously difficult thing to do. we are a people that like to speak about one another and not always in positive ways. And there's a very, very famous book about this in Hebrew. It's it was it, it's about the laws of Lashon Hara, and there's as I said, for Jews, there's books that have the laws of Lashon Hara in daily study. Here's a circumstance. Here's what the right thing to do is in this circumstance. Very, very detailed. But at the end of this book, the rabbi who we call the Chavetz Chaim, which comes from Psalms, but that's another whole story. He says it is worthwhile to study these laws, even if at the end of your study, all you can do is sigh, like to say, I can't hold myself to that standard. That's really hard for me. I'm not built like that. So I'm trying to give you a deeper understanding, but I also want to be real with you and say, okay, Ginny just said, it sounds like Lashon Hara shows the lack of emunah. It does. But it is also, when I get to the end, I just have a few more things I want to share. You'll see one of the reasons why it's so hard. So in the Jewish community, we have this practice where somebody will start a rotation. Let's say that you're, as a community, somebody in your community is hurting in some way. Somebody's sick, somebody is going through a difficult time, somebody's waiting for news of a hostage, whatever. You want to accumulate spiritual merit for this person. One of the things that we do is set up a watch 24 hours a day where somebody in every 2 or 3 hour period takes a pledge that they will not speak any Lashon Hara during that 2 or 3 hour period. And so that as a community, all around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, there are somebody being careful about their speech. Okay. And that is a form of spiritual merit that we direct towards whatever the person or the family is that's in crisis. Now, that's not something that gives the impression that this is really easy to do, because you're just committing for 2 hours or 3 hours that you're going to be very conscious of everything that comes out of your mouth. So I'm acknowledging that this is both it's a very serious sin in God's world, and why, and it's also very hard to do at the stage that we are living in now. Okay, so it is through speech that we combine the spiritual with the physical. Okay, you need breath, you need vocal cords, you need a tongue, you need lips, you need teeth, you need all that to create speech. Okay, but it's so in that sense it's physical, but it's a manifestation of the 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 spiritual part of you. Now, the opposite of Lashon Hara, by the way, is called Lashon HaTov, which is good speech. And it expresses the unity between the physical and the spiritual parts of a person. When all the parts of a person are unified, they form an entity that can draw energy from the source of all life, which is the oneness of God. And evil speech closes this gateway to the spiritual world. So a person who speaks Lashon Hara routinely is stuck in this physical world where they only have their own individual resources upon which to draw. So the implications, I think, are clear that we all benefit because we're all connected. We all benefit from each other's merits and we all suffer from each other's faults. If everybody truly felt that way, then we would want to conceal the faults of anyone else as much as we want to conceal our own shortcomings. Yes, Andrea says in this tech age, Lashon Hara can be through the written word too. Through the written word, through social media, through talkbacks, through comments on articles. It is really, it is everywhere. And to refrain from it in this, maybe, maybe when the world was a simpler place, it was somewhat easier, but now we're surrounded, like people don't even know what's wrong. People don't, if you've never heard the concept of Lashon Hara, and I think, I mean, maybe there are some of you who have, but I suspect that most of you have heard this concept, even if you haven't heard these deeper ideas. But most people don't even have any idea that it's wrong, that it is, that God does not want this from us, that it is harmful. And so let me just connect this, and with this I'll finish. I want to connect this to the idea of Geula. Okay, so how does Lashon Hara come into the world? When God created Adam and Chava, when God created Adam and Eve, He did not create them with this. I was going to call it an instinct, but I don't think that's quite the right word. With this desire to harm one another with speech. Okay, Lashon Hara is introduced into the world by the snake in the Garden of Eden. Okay, the one that convinced Chava, Eve, to eat from the Eitz Hadas Tov Hara, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, against God's will. The snake in Hebrew is called a nachash. Okay, so he uses the Lashon Hara and lies and misrepresentation, and to introduce exile into humanity. And the exile of humanity from the Garden of Eden won't conclude until Mashiach ends it. So here's the beginning of time. We have the Nachash, the snake, and the end of time we have Mashiach. And how are they related? So this is really fascinating. The numerical value of the Hebrew word Nachash is 358. Okay. Remember we were talking about the letter Yud, that when we want to say 11, we use a Yud and an Aleph, right? Because so every Hebrew word, you're probably familiar with this idea, but every Hebrew word has a numerical value, and you get it by adding up the numerical value of the letters in the word. Okay, so then it's called gematria. So the numerical value, or the gematria of the word nachash, is 358, which is equivalent to the numerical value of what? Mashiach, which is also 358. Is that not cool? Okay, so Mashiach brings the tikkun. What is the tikkun? The spiritual rectification for Lashon Hara that the Nachash introduced to the world. The Nachash and Mashiach, they even actually kind of sound similar, represent opposite sides of the same coin. The snake caused us to go into exile, and Mashiach brings us out of exile. I mean that in the fullest sense. Okay. Now, what I didn't cover, I didn't even touch any of the laws, what you are allowed to say, what you're not allowed to say, when you're allowed to say it, what happens in this situation, blah, 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 blah. Those are, as I said, very, very detailed, but I wanted to give you a more spiritual way of understanding why God does not want us doing this, and why it facilitates better human interaction. It facilitates more peace in the world. And in the Messianic era, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, will have no power over us, and we won't have a desire to do it. But every time we speak about somebody in a negative way, there are spiritual implications of that. And I would also say that not only is it on you, well, whoever the speaker is, but also the person who's being spoken about is also harmed, and also the person who's the listener. And so um, in the Jewish world, there are some people who will say, if they sense that the conversation is going in that direction, they will say, that's Lashon Hara, I don't want to hear it. Like, shut up the conversation or leave the room, absent themselves from the situation, because they know, just even if they're not the ones who said it, just hearing other people speak like that about a third party is harmful to them spiritually. So I am aware that um, this is a big ask from God. I mean, it's not coming from me. Um, right. So Andrea says, for non-Jews, learning to be aware and be kind in your speech may be enough. I would say, if you are not sensitive about this now, to just start to notice in your life how much of what you say and the people that you spend your time with, whether they are family members or colleagues or whomever, um, how much of their speech falls into this category. It's really quite astonishing um, when you start being sensitive to it, how much of human interaction is driven by this negativity. And I have a friend who lives here in Efrat who is just the nicest person and never says a bad thing about anybody and always thinks the best of everybody and always gives, like, she throws out compliments like, like cherry blossoms. It's such a lovely thing. And it's not I'm not at that level. And I don't know, when she's home privately, when she's just talking to her husband, I don't know. I just never hear her in, whether it's in a community list, or if it's in private conversation, or if it's in a group, whatever. She's just always speaking positively about people. And I think, just like, as if we are parents and we have more than one child, when our children speak nicely about one another, that is what we call in Hebrew nachat. That is a certain kind of pleasure, that a joy that we get. And I think that God thinks of us as the same way. If we are all his children and we are speaking nicely about one another, we are recognizing what is good in one another and focusing on that. I think that brings him a lot of joy and pleasure. Okay, we're almost finished, and I pretty much said what I prepared. I just want to go back to the comments, because sometimes you guys have really substantive comments and I don't always have time to look at them. Okay, so Kathy Craig says, it seems to be a primary tool used in politics, tearing down the other to elevate oneself. Absolutely true. Harry asks, does this make anyone think of Noah in chapter 9? Shem and Yafet covered his nakedness and did not expose his drunkenness. Our speech drives our actions. That's very interesting. Okay. And then Andrea continues that Lashon Hara can even make you feel icky. And if you understand it in the context that I've tried to share with you tonight, that's very true, because if you're not aware that it's something that Hashem does not want us doing, if you're not aware of the spiritual damage that it causes to you, to the person who's listening, and to the person that you're speaking about, if you're not even like aware of it, it doesn't make much of an impression on you. But now you know. So I'm going to encourage you in this next week, besides learning the letter Yud and finding it in your Hebrew text, to just pay attention and maybe challenge yourself to go an hour. And I'm not talking about like from 3 to 4 in the morning when you're asleep. I'm talking about like when you're active in the middle of your day, to try to pay attention, to try to go an hour without saying anything negative about anybody else. Okay, when you are interacting with other people. Okay, Brittany asks, witchcraft is manipulation. I feel like there's a parallel to Lashon Hara. That is a big question I cannot answer off the top of my head, but I'm happy to get back to it. Okay, so this is our hour. Anybody who needs to leave is you have to go to work or whatever. But I just want to give anybody who has a chance that actually wants to say something instead of typing a comment. Is there anybody who wants to say something as we finish up? No.
Even if you're not aware of Lashon Hara and the spiritual it can still make you feel icky when you gossip and all those things. They make you feel unclean.
If you are a good person, yeah, because even just intuitively, without this whole explanation that I just spent an hour giving you, it can give you this sense that this is probably not something to be proud of. In addition, if you are the victim of Lashon Hara, that is, if people say nasty stuff about you and it gets back to you, just you understand how that feels. And it's probably, I mean, I'm imagining it's happened to all of us, but certainly to me, who is a person who, in certain respects, is out there in the world, doing what I do, and it's in a controversial way. I get plenty of that. As a rabbi's wife, I got plenty of that. Like the more you are in a public position, the more you sort of um, attract that kind of stuff. It's not. It makes you feel icky when you are the recipient of it as well. Yeah, you
Rivka,
want
can
to say
I
something?
ask, like,
Go ahead.
can you hear me?
I can.
Marrying into a Jewish family, I was really convicted that it seemed like this was kind of not a perfect element in the family, but there was a sensibility about how people were discussed, or the passion in someone else was um commended or elevated. Do you find that, I know it's a generalization, but is this just a general concept within a Jewish community, even if it's not like a Torah observing ultra
It's
religious
okay.
group?
So when I was growing up, I'd never heard of Lashon Hara, and I didn't know it was a thing, and it certainly wasn't anything that I noticed that people were particularly careful about. Um, so I only know it in the context of Torah observant communities. Now that doesn't mean, by the way, that everybody who's Torah observant is doesn't slip and trip on this regularly. Um, there's a whole organization called the Chavetz Chaim Heritage Foundation, it's called, and they have all kinds of. They publish books, they put out videos, they have all kinds of tools to help people once you become sensitive about this, to maintain your vigilance about it. But I would say that you're very lucky if you married into a family that already has this sensitivity, whether they are Torah observant or not, however it came down to them. It is it's a wonderful thing, because when um, we tend to, there's an expression, I don't know what it is, we tend to like float up to the level. Like if we're around people who are very careful about the way that they speak about others, it impacts us and makes us feel like, oh well, I can't, go dirty and roll around in the dirt with someone, about someone, if the people around me would never do that. Because that's, so you're very lucky to have had that experience, because I think most people um, don't necessarily know people who are conscious and careful about this. Kathy says one of the hardest things for me is how to discuss an issue you may have with another person, where you need to describe a behavior without drifting into Lashon Hara. So that is where I would say, for a Jew, you would go to a rabbi who is well versed in these laws, and you would say, "Here's the situation. What am I allowed to say, and what am I not allowed to say? I don't want you to leave here thinking Lashon Hara means that if somebody's in danger, or if there's trouble in a relationship, that you can never say anything to another person um, about behavior that's like off the mark. That's not what it means at all. But it has to be done. You can't go talk to a third party about a problem that you're having with so and so. And there are certain exceptions to this in the laws and so forth. For example, the rules in a therapeutic relationship would be very different than just like two friends talking about a third friend or something like that. So I don't want you to think that Lashon Hara is across the board. You may never say anything negative about another person, because sometimes it's absolutely necessary, and that's where we have guidelines, and that's like the story that I told you. Like I had something very negative to express, but I was trying to protect this young woman from marrying a swindler. So that exists. Okay, So thank you very much for joining me. Thank you for getting the time right. And I am always happy to hear from you in the group during the week. And I will send the video out as soon as I can. All right. Be blessed. Thank you.